Do you ever wonder what happened to knowledge when the world seemed to fall apart? Think about a time when cities crumbled, empires faded, and much of what people knew seemed to disappear. We are talking about the period often called the Dark Ages, roughly from 500 AD to 1000 AD. How did ancient wisdom, scientific breakthroughs, and deep philosophical ideas survive such a challenging era? Who were the unsung heroes who kept the flame of learning flickering? Number 1. History keepers, chronicling the present for future generations. Monks did more than just copy old books. They were also busy writing new ones, keeping track of the world around them. These new writings, often called annals or chronicles, captured the events of their own time. Monasteries served as vital centers for gathering and recording local and regional history. A great example of this is the Venerable Bede, a monk from the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria. Bede's monumental work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731 AD, paints a detailed picture of early English history, focusing on the spread of Christianity and the lives of saints and kings. He diligently collected information from various sources, including old records, letters, and oral traditions, creating a historical narrative that spans several centuries before his own time and continues into his present. His meticulous approach to sourcing information set a high standard for historical writing. Another remarkable example is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This collection of historical records was started in Anglo-Saxon England, likely during the reign of Alfred the Great in the late 9th century. Monasteries across England continue to update and expand this chronicle over several centuries, each adding its own entries about local and national events. These entries include details about invasions by Viking raiders, battles fought, changes in rulers, important religious developments, and even natural phenomena like eclipses or severe weather. One entry might talk about a great famine in a particular year, while another records the death of a king and the succession of his heir. The different versions of the chronicle, kept in various monasteries, sometimes offer slightly different perspectives on the same events. Showing the independent work being done in these isolated centers, monks recorded much more than just political history. They documented the lives of saints, known as hagiographies. These stories, while often filled with miraculous events, also provide valuable insights into the daily lives, beliefs, and social structures of the time. For instance, the life of Saint Columba, written by Adomnin, the abbot of Iona, in the late 7th century, describes Columba's missionary work among the Picts in Scotland and includes vivid descriptions of landscapes, customs, and the challenges faced by early Christian missionaries. These narratives helped spread Christian teachings and provided moral examples for the faithful, but they also preserved glimpses of a world that would otherwise be lost to time. The process of chronicling was often methodical. Monasteries would keep annual records, sometimes simply adding a single sentence for each year in the margin of an Easter table. Over time, these brief notes would expand into longer, more detailed accounts. A monk might be assigned the specific task of keeping the monastery's chronicle up to date. This required a keen eye for significant events, a good memory, and the ability to organize information. Chronicles were not always written by a single person, but often by a succession of scribes who continued the work of their predecessors. This collective effort over generations ensured the continuity of historical record-keeping. The monastic chronicler's perspective was unique. They often saw events through the lens of divine providence, attributing successes and failures to God's will or the actions of saints. However, this spiritual outlook did not stop them from recording factual details, such as dates, names, and locations. These facts, even if presented within a religious framework, are incredibly useful for modern historians trying to piece together the fragmented history of the Dark Ages. Without the diligence of these monks, much of what we know about this period would simply not exist. For example, the detailed accounts of Viking raids in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle give us a first-hand view of the terror and disruption caused by these incursions, providing context for the fortifications and military responses of the era. Monks also kept detailed records of their own monasteries, known as Cartillaries. These books contained copies of charters, deeds, land grants, and legal documents. They preserve the legal and economic history of the monastic institution itself. Cartillary from the monastery of St. Gall, for instance, might contain records of land donations made by local nobles, agreements with neighboring villages, or official decrees from emperors. These documents, while not historical narratives in the grand sense, are invaluable primary sources that shed light on land ownership, economic transactions, and the relationship between the monastery and secular society. They offer a tangible connection to the practical administration of these large and influential institutions. Careful preservation of these records meant that the monastery's rights and property were protected across generations, demonstrating a foresight that extended far beyond simply copying religious texts. The writing of these contemporary histories was a labor of love and necessity. It was a commitment to future generations to ensure that the memory of events both great and small would not vanish. The monk, hunched over his parchment, quill in hand, was not just recording facts. He was building a bridge across time, connecting his present to the unseen future. The very act of writing down these events, day after day, year after year, speaks to a deep sense of responsibility and a profound understanding of the value of recorded memory. This silent, persistent effort, carried out in quiet scriptoriums across Europe, ensured that the Dark Ages were not entirely dark, but illuminated by the careful historical accounts of those who lived through them. Number 2. Linguistic Lifelings, translating across time and tongues. The knowledge of the ancient world was not all written in Latin. A vast amount of classical Greek philosophy, science, and medicine existed. As the Roman Empire declined in the West, knowledge of Greek diminished significantly. Few people in Western Europe could read Greek, which meant that many foundational texts were inaccessible. This is where certain monks and scholars played a crucial role. They became linguistic lifelines, translating these vital works into Latin, the common language of scholarship in Western Europe. One of the most famous figures in this effort was Boethius, a Roman scholar who lived in the early 6th century. Although not a monk himself, his work laid crucial groundwork that monasteries later built upon. He embarked on an ambitious project to translate all of Aristotle's and Plato's works from Greek into Latin. While he did not complete this monumental task before his untimely death, his translations of Aristotle's logical treatises were incredibly influential. These texts became the primary source for understanding Aristotelian logic in Western Europe for centuries. Monasteries, as centers of learning, copied and studied these translations, ensuring that Aristotle's rigorous methods of reasoning remained part of the intellectual landscape. Without Boethius's initial effort, a huge chunk of ancient philosophy might have been lost to the Latin-speaking world for much longer. Another key figure was Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman who, like Boethius, lived in the 6th century. After a career in public service, Cassiodorus founded the Vivarium monastery in southern Italy. He saw the urgent need to preserve knowledge. He actively encouraged the monks at Vivarium to copy and study both secular and religious texts. More importantly, he championed the translation of Greek works. He believed that understanding Greek was essential for a complete education and for accessing the full range of classical knowledge. He personally supervised the creation of Latin versions of Greek texts, including works by Greek church fathers. His commitment to learning and translation profoundly influenced the monastic tradition that followed. Vivarium became a model for later monastic scriptoriums, emphasizing not just copying, but also the critical study and transmission of knowledge. The process of translation was painstaking. It was not a simple word-for-word conversion. Ancient Greek, with its complex grammar and rich vocabulary, presented significant challenges. Translators had to grapple with nuances of meaning, philosophical concepts for which no direct Latin equivalent existed, and the stylistic differences between the two languages. Sometimes, a translator might have to invent a new Latin term to convey a specific Greek idea. This intellectual effort required deep understanding of both languages and the subject matter. The act of translation was an act of interpretation and creation, not just transcription. Carolingian Renaissance, spurred by Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, further highlighted the importance of translation. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe, including the renowned Alcuin of York, to improve education and standardize texts. While much of this era focused on correcting Latin texts and improving literacy, there was also a renewed interest in Greek. Some Irish monks, who had maintained a stronger connection to Greek learning than their continental counterparts, played a role in bringing some of this knowledge back into circulation. They had preserved older Greek texts and sometimes engaged in their own translation efforts. These translated texts were not merely curiosities. They formed the bedrock of medieval scholarship. Medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates, translated into Latin, guided medical practice for centuries. Mathematical and astronomical treatises from ancient Greek sources, even if only partially understood or transmitted, kept the flame of scientific inquiry alive. Philosophical works, especially those of Aristotle, profoundly influenced medieval theology and philosophy, shaping the intellectual debates within universities centuries later. The translations provided access to a wider range of thought than would have been available if only Latin originals had survived. The very act of translation was an active engagement with the text, demanding intellectual rigor and a high degree of scholarship. It was a conscious effort to bridge a cultural and linguistic divide that threatened to sever Western Europe from its classical roots. These monks, through their meticulous work, ensured that the intellectual heritage of Greece was not entirely lost, even as political and social structures crumbled around them. They ensured that the wisdom of the ancients could continue to influence future generations, setting the stage for later revivals of classical learning. Their quiet diligence in rendering one language into another was a vital link in the long chain of knowledge transmission. Number 3. Book doctors, creating durability through binding and preservation. It was not enough to simply copy a book or translate a text. The physical book itself needed to survive. Monasteries were not just places for writing. They were also workshops where books were carefully crafted and protected. The monks became book doctors, mastering the intricate art of bookbinding and developing techniques to ensure the long-term preservation of their precious manuscripts. This physical preservation was just as important as the intellectual act of copying. The process began long before the binding stage. Parchment, made from animal skins, was the primary writing material. It was durable, but also susceptible to damage from moisture, pests, and rough handling. Each sheet of parchment once written upon had to be carefully folded and gathered into quires or booklets. These quires were then meticulously sewn together. The monks used strong linen or hemp thread, stitching through the folds of the parchment and attaching them to horizontal bands, often made of leather or cord. This careful stitching was the foundation of the book's structural integrity, ensuring that the pages remained together and could be turned without tearing. The covers of these books were incredibly robust. They were typically made from thick wooden boards, cut to size and smooth. These wooden boards provided a rigid shield against physical damage. Once the sewn quires were attached to these boards, the entire assembly was covered in leather, often animal hides like pigskin, calfskin, or goatskin. The leather was stretched tightly over the boards and spine, then glued or stitched into place. This created a durable protective casing that could withstand the rigors of time and use. The leather also offered some protection against moisture and dust. Sometimes the leather was decorated with blind tooling or patterns pressed into the surface, without color, to further protect the book, especially from wear and tear on the edges and corners. Metal corner pieces and clasps were often added. These clasps, typically made of brass or bronze, were attached to the wooden boards and allowed the book to be securely fastened shut. This prevented the pages from warping or being damaged when the book was not in use. It also helped keep dust and dirt from entering the pages. The addition of these metal elements transformed a collection of fragile pages into a sturdy, resilient object designed to last for centuries. The storage conditions within monastic libraries also played a crucial role. Books were kept in dry, cool environments, away from direct sunlight or excessive humidity. These conditions helped prevent the parchment from deteriorating, molding, or becoming brittle. Monks understood that proper ventilation was necessary to prevent dampness. Books were often stored flat on shelves or in special chests, rather than standing upright, which could put stress on the binding. In some early libraries, books might have been kept in cupboards or armoires, further protecting them from dust and fluctuations in temperature. Protection against pests was another ongoing battle. Rodents like mice and rats were a constant threat, capable of gnawing through parchment and bindings. Insects, especially bookworms, larvae of certain beetles, could bore through pages, leaving trails of destruction. Monks would have used whatever means available to deter these pests, though specific methods are not always well documented. The heavy wooden covers and metal clasps provided some defense, but constant vigilance was necessary. Regular cleaning of the library and careful handling of the books were essential practices. When books inevitably suffered damage from frequent use, accidents, or the passage of time, monks often undertook repairs. They would meticulously mend torn pages, re-sew loose quires, and rebind covers that had come apart. This repair work was often done by the same scribes or other monks skilled in the craft. They saw it as their duty to maintain these treasures. A damaged book meant that its knowledge was at risk, so the repair was not just about aesthetics, but about preserving the information within. This continuous maintenance ensured that many manuscripts survived multiple centuries of handling and storage. The physical construction of these books was an impressive feat of craftsmanship, a testament to the dedication of the monastic communities. Each book was a labor of love, from the preparation of the parchment to the final binding. The entire process involved specialized skills, from tanning animal hides to woodworking, metalworking, and precise needlework. This holistic approach, encompassing both the creation of content and the physical preservation of the vessel, was fundamental to how knowledge was saved during the Dark Ages. The strength and resilience of these medieval bindings are evident today, as many books from that era still exist in collections around the world, a direct result of the meticulous care and engineering that went into their construction. Number 4. Art of the Ages. Illuminations and calligraphy that shined. Monks did not just copy text. They transformed books into breathtaking works of art. Creation of illuminated manuscripts with their intricate decorations and stunning calligraphy was not merely an aesthetic pursuit. This artistic endeavor served as a powerful preservation strategy. By making books beautiful and valuable, monks increased their chances of survival. A visually magnificent book was less likely to be discarded, damaged, or used for mundane purposes. It became a treasure worthy of exceptional care and protection. The Irish and Anglo-Saxon monasteries were particularly renowned for their insular art. Masterpieces like the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Durrow stand as enduring testaments to this artistic tradition. These manuscripts are not just texts. They are vibrant explosions of color and pattern. The Book of Kells believed to have been created around 800 AD, possibly at Iona or Kells, is famous for its Chi-Rho page, an unbelievably detailed monogram of Christ's name. This single page is a labyrinth of swirling spirals, interlaced patterns, and fantastic beasts, all rendered with incredible precision. The sheer complexity of the design and the perfection of its execution speak to years of dedicated work by multiple skilled hands. The materials used in these illuminations were incredibly precious and often sourced from far away. Gold leaf was applied to create shimmering surfaces, giving an ethereal glow to holy texts. The pigments themselves were often rare and expensive. Lapis lazuli, for example, used to produce the vibrant blue color, had to be imported from Afghanistan. Other colors came from minerals or plant extracts, all requiring careful preparation to create stable, long-lasting paints. The monks developed sophisticated recipes for mixing these pigments with binders like egg white to create vibrant and durable colors that have retained their brilliance for over 1,000 years. Creation of an illuminated page was a multi-stage process. First, the scribe would write the main text in a beautiful, consistent hand, a skill known as calligraphy. Then the illuminator would draw the outline of the designs, often using a stylus to lightly mark the parchment. Finally, the colors would be applied, layer by layer, with tiny brushes made from animal hair. This demanded incredible patience, steady hands, and an artistic vision. The artistic elements often carried symbolic meaning, with specific animals, plants, and patterns representing theological concepts or stories. A lion might symbolize Saint Mark, or a dove might represent the Holy Spirit. The script itself, the calligraphy, was also an art form. Monks developed various scripts over the centuries, each with its own beauty and readability. Angel script, with its rounded, capital letters, was common in early Christian manuscripts. Insular majuscule, developed in Ireland and Britain, featured distinct letter forms and decorative initials. Later, during the Carolingian Renaissance, a more legible and standardized script called Carolingian minuscule was developed. This script, clearer and more uniform, made texts easier to read and copy, a practical improvement that also reflected an artistic commitment to elegant script. Consistency and precision of these calligraphic hands are astounding, especially considering the lack of modern tools. By investing so much time, effort, and expensive materials into their books, monks elevated the status of these texts far beyond mere documents. An illuminated manuscript became a sacred object, a testament to faith and devotion. This inherent value meant that such books were carefully guarded, stored in secure libraries, and protected from the ravages of war, theft, or neglect. While many ordinary documents might have perished, these artistic treasures were often saved, even carried to safety during times of invasion or upheaval. For instance, the Book of Kells was hidden away to protect it from Viking raids. The artistry also served a practical purpose in an era where literacy was not widespread. The illustrations helped to explain religious stories and concepts to those who could not read the text. The visual narrative made the message more accessible and memorable, ensuring the transmission of religious knowledge to a wider audience, even if that audience was primarily made up of fellow monks or high-ranking church officials. The beauty of the work also fostered a deeper reverence for the sacred texts, encouraging their study and preservation. The long hours spent in the scriptorium, hunched over a parchment, applying tiny flecks of gold or minute brushstrokes of color, speaks volumes about the dedication of these monastic artists. It was not just a job, it was a form of spiritual devotion. Each stroke, each carefully placed pigment was an act of worship. This profound commitment to both the content and the physical form of the book was a monumental factor in ensuring that many of the most important texts survived the tumultuous Dark Ages, reaching us today not just as words, but as breathtaking works of art that continued to inspire awe. Number 5. Brain Power Unleashed. Monastic schools and learning centers. Monasteries were not just quiet places where monks copied books in isolation. They were vibrant centers of learning where knowledge was not only preserved, but actively taught and disseminated. These monastic schools were vital intellectual hubs during a time when formal education outside the church had largely collapsed across much of Western Europe. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most Western monasteries, explicitly emphasized the importance of reading and study, setting a foundation for a culture of learning within monastic walls. For new monks entering the community, education was a core part of their formation. Novices were taught to read and write Latin, the lingua franca of scholarship and the church. This was crucial for understanding the Bible, theological texts, and the various treatises copied in the scriptorium. Beyond basic literacy, monks were introduced to a structured curriculum that often followed the model of the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium focused on language and logic, grammar, which taught correct Latin usage, rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, and dialectic or logic, the principles of reasoning and argumentation. Quadrivium delved into mathematical and scientific subjects, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music theory. While the depth of study in these subjects varied from monastery to monastery, the very presence of this curriculum meant that monks were actively engaging with ancient knowledge, not just passively copying it. They were learning the tools of intellectual inquiry that had been developed in antiquity. For instance, studying geometry might involve engaging with Euclidean principles, even if only through simplified texts. Astronomy meant understanding the movements of celestial bodies, often for the practical purpose of calculating the date of Easter. This continued engagement with classical subjects, even within a religious context, ensured that these branches of knowledge were not entirely forgotten. Many abbots themselves were renowned scholars who attracted students and further elevated the intellectual standing of their monasteries. For example, the monastery of Fulda in Germany, founded by Saint Boniface, became a prominent intellectual center in the Carolingian era under abbots like Rabanus Maurus in the 9th century. Rabanus Maurus was a prolific writer and teacher whose encyclopedic works helped transmit a wide range of knowledge, from grammar to theology, to his students and across Europe. His efforts ensured that Fulda was a place not just of copying, but of vibrant intellectual exchange. Charlemagne's push for an educational revival in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, known as the Carolingian Renaissance, heavily relied on monastic schools. Charlemagne invited scholars from across Europe, such as Alcuin of York, to establish and improve schools within monasteries and cathedrals. Alcuin became the abbot of Tours and transformed its scriptorium and school into leading centers for producing accurate texts and educating the next generation of scholars. Charlemagne's decree, the Admonitio Generalis of 789 AD, explicitly ordered that monasteries should not only copy books, but also establish schools for boys to learn reading. This royal patronage gave a significant boost to monastic education, leading to an increase in literacy and the standardization of texts across the empire. Monastic schools also served as places where knowledge was disseminated, albeit slowly. While primarily for future monks, some monasteries also provided elementary education for local children or training for secular clerks who would serve in royal or noble courts. This meant that the intellectual currents flowing within monastic walls sometimes spilled out into the wider society, helping to maintain a basic level of literacy and classical understanding among a small but influential segment of the population. Transmission of knowledge was not an unidirectional flow from past to present. It was also a dynamic process of teaching and learning that shaped individuals. The act of teaching required monks to truly understand the texts they were preserving. It wasn't enough to simply copy words. They had to grasp their meaning, explain complex ideas, and answer questions. This pedagogical aspect fostered a deeper engagement with the material, ensuring that the knowledge remained living and active, not just dormant on a shelf. Questions posed by students, the need to prepare lectures, and the process of discussion all contributed to the intellectual vitality of these monastic communities. In essence, these monastic schools provided a continuous thread of intellectual activity through the Dark Ages. They were the primary institutions where the skills of reading, writing, and logical thought were passed down. They ensured that the languages of scholarship, particularly Latin, remained alive and functional. Without these centers, the ability to engage with and understand the classical texts would have withered much more rapidly, leaving a far greater intellectual void. The quiet classrooms within monastery walls, where young monks learned the trivium and quadrivium, were crucial in keeping the intellectual flame flickering, patiently waiting for the resurgence of broader learning in later centuries. Number 6. The Ancient Google. Monastic libraries, hidden treasures. Once monks had copied thousands of texts, they needed a place to keep them, protect them, and make them accessible for study. This led to the creation and development of monastic libraries, which became true ancient Googles of their time. These libraries were not just storage rooms. They were organized repositories of knowledge, carefully kibuted and protected, serving as vital intellectual arteries in the otherwise fragmented landscape of the Dark Ages. The growth of monastic libraries was a slow, cumulative process. Early monasteries might have had only a handful of books, perhaps kept in a chest or a niche in the cloister. But as scriptoriums became more productive, collections began to expand. Books were incredibly valuable, often representing years of labor and significant financial investment in parchment and materials. Their storage was therefore a matter of utmost importance. Monasteries developed systematic ways to store and protect their books. In larger monasteries, dedicated library rooms began to emerge. These rooms were often designed with thick walls, small windows, and secure doors to protect against fire, theft, and environmental damage. The environment was key. Monks understood the need for dry, cool conditions to prevent parchment from molding or becoming brittle. Books were stored on shelves, often horizontally or on lecterns, rather than standing upright to prevent stress on the bindings. Some of the most famous and well-preserved monastic libraries provide glimpses into these practices. The Abbey of Bobbio in northern Italy, founded by the Irish monk Saint Columbanus in the early 7th century, accumulated an incredible collection of manuscripts. Its library, known to have housed hundreds of volumes by the 9th century, contained a diverse range of texts, including theological works, classical literature, legal codes, and scientific treatises. The sheer breadth of their collection was remarkable for the time, demonstrating a commitment to universal knowledge. Another stellar example is the library at the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. Established in the 8th century, its collection grew rapidly and became one of the most important intellectual centers of medieval Europe. The library still exists today and holds some of the oldest and most significant manuscripts from the Dark Ages, including early Irish manuscripts and unique historical documents. Monks at St. Gall created detailed inventory lists, sometimes called catalogs, which listed every book in their collection. These catalogs provide invaluable insights into what was being read, studied, and copied at the time. They show a clear attempt to organize and manage the growing volume of knowledge, making it easier for monks to find specific texts for study or reference. The concept of a working library was central. These books were not simply for display. They were tools for study, prayer, and teaching. Monks would borrow books for specific periods, take them to their cells or the cloister to read and contemplate. This constant use meant that books were handled frequently, which necessitated robust bindings, as discussed earlier, and continuous care. Some precious manuscripts were so valuable that they were chained to the library desks or lecterns to prevent theft or unauthorized removal. This practice, though perhaps seeming restrictive, was a common security measure in an age when books were literally worth their weight in gold. Beyond simply housing books, these libraries also functioned as centers for scholarly exchange. Monks might travel between monasteries to consult rare texts or borrow manuscripts for copying. This intermonastic network helped to circulate knowledge and prevent its complete loss in any single location. If one monastery's library was destroyed by fire or invasion, there was a chance that copies of its texts existed elsewhere. This redundancy, though accidental, was a crucial factor in the survival of many ancient works. The systematic cataloging of books was an early form of information management. These handwritten lists, often organized by subject matter or author, allowed monks to navigate their collections. Catalog might list books of the Old Testament, books of the New Testament, works of the Church Fathers, classical authors, or medical treatises. This rudimentary classification system, though far from modern library science, was a practical way to manage large collections and facilitate access to information. The monastic library was in many ways the beating heart of the monastery's intellectual life. It was a place of quiet contemplation, diligent study, and relentless preservation. The monks who maintained these libraries were the custodians of Europe's intellectual heritage, carefully guarding the flickering flame of knowledge against the encroaching darkness. Their dedication ensured that ancient wisdom, scientific insights, and philosophical debates survived the trials of a turbulent age, ready to be rediscovered and built upon in later centuries. Number 7. Scriptorium secrets. The copying powerhouses. The most direct and fundamental way monks preserved knowledge during the Dark Ages was through the relentless, painstaking process of copying manuscripts. Picture this: a quiet room often unheated in a monastery. A few monks, or sometimes dozens, hunched over wooden desks. They are scribes, their fingers often numb with cold, their eyes strained from working by meager lamplight, or the faint glow of daylight filtering through small windows. This is the scriptorium, the heart of knowledge preservation. The daily life of a scribe was one of intense discipline and physical endurance. They would typically begin their work after morning prayers, often laboring for many hours, sometimes up to 6 or 7 hours a day, broken only by meals and other monastic duties. The work was slow, methodical, and prone to error. Copying an entire book, especially a large one like the Bible, could take a single scribe several years. A full Bible, for instance, could require around 300 to 500 sheets of parchment, totaling 600 to 1,000 pages, depending on the script and size. This massive undertaking often involved multiple scribes working in shifts or on different sections of the same book. The materials used were expensive and required significant preparation. Parchment, made from treated animal skins, usually sheep, goat, or calf, was the primary writing surface. Producing parchment was a laborious process. Skins had to be cleaned, soaked in lime, scraped to remove hair and flesh, stretched on frames, and then carefully smoothed with pumice stone. Quality of parchment varied. Vellum, made from calfskin, was considered the finest and most expensive. A single large book could require the skins of dozens or even hundreds of animals, making it an incredibly valuable commodity. Ink was typically made from soot, gallnuts, or iron salts, mixed with gum, Arabic, and water. Scribes used quills, usually made from goose feathers, which needed constant sharpening with a small knife. Each dip of the quill into the inkwell covered only a few words, demanding immense focus and a steady hand. constant repetition of letter forms, the meticulous attention to detail, and the avoidance of mistakes were paramount. Errors could be costly, requiring sections of parchment to be scraped clean or entire pages to be rewritten. Monasteries like Vivarium, founded by Cassiodorus in the 6th century in southern Italy, became early pioneers in systematic manuscript copying. Cassiodorus instilled in his monks the importance of preserving both religious and secular knowledge, actively collecting and copying texts from classical authors like Virgil, Cicero, and the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, alongside the Bible and works of the Church. This deliberate effort ensured that crucial aspects of classical learning were not lost to the emerging medieval world. In the British Isles, monasteries such as Lindisfarne and Iona in the 7th and 8th centuries became renowned for their scriptoriums, producing magnificent illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells. These books were not just copied, they were painstakingly decorated, each page a work of art, a testament to the skill and devotion of the scribes and illuminators. The very act of making these books so beautiful contributed to their preservation, as their artistic value encouraged their careful safekeeping. The standardization of scripts was another key development. Early medieval scripts were often difficult to read. During the Carolingian Renaissance, under the patronage of Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, scholars like Alcuin of York at the Abbey of Tours promoted a new, clearer script called Carolingian minuscule. This legible, uniform script made copying faster and more accurate, and it significantly improved the readability of texts. The widespread adoption of Carolingian minuscule across Europe was a monumental achievement, directly aiding the efficient transmission of knowledge. Many of our modern lowercase letters are derived from this script. The types of texts copied were vast and varied. While religious texts like the Bible, psalters, and liturgical books formed the core, monks also copied works of history, philosophy, medicine, law, and even ancient Greek and Roman literature. Without their tireless efforts, many of these classical works would simply have vanished. They copied scientific treatises like those on astronomy, which were important for calculating the date of Easter. They copied medical texts, which provided the only available knowledge on healing for centuries. They copied legal codes, preserving the foundations of civil order. The silence of the scriptorium was broken only by the scratching of quills, the rustle of parchment, and perhaps the murmured prayers of the scribes. Each copied line, each painstakingly formed letter, was an act of profound dedication, was an intellectual relay race where monks passed the torch of knowledge from one generation to the next, often without ever knowing the true impact of their work. They were the human photopayers of their era, literally hand-duplicating the written heritage of civilization. This continuous, painstaking labor of copying was the bedrock upon which all other forms of knowledge preservation in the Dark Ages rested. Without the scriptorium, much of what we know about the ancient world and the early medieval period would simply not exist.